My name is Ed Jolie. I'm the Clara Tanner Associate Curator of Ethnology here at the Arizona State Museum and Associate Professor in the School of Anthropology. We're very fortunate today to have with us two guests. On my left here is Chris Lewis from Zuni and Austin Coochyamptewa from Hopi. And we've been lucky enough to have the last couple of days to spend time in the archaeological and historic collections here at the Arizona State Museum, selecting a few objects that spoke to us individually as well as collectively, and wanted to take this opportunity to speak to some of the ways in which the archaeological record, as it is preserved and retained in museum collections, helps us tell the long-term story of Native American ingenuity, technological innovation, and sophistication. And some of the great ways that we can do this are through these objects, these baskets and textile fabrications that don't typically survive because they're organic, they typically decay. And so in these rare circumstances where we have exceptional preservation, we have these really unique windows into the past. And what that allows us to do is make these bridges between the past and the present to identify commonalities in the ways of doing things. And I think in some senses, thinking about things that tell us a little bit more about not just what transpired in the past, how people made a living in the past, but also reinforces the ways in which the past and narratives about the past continue to speak to us in the present. And so with that, we have a selection of archaeological items that come from the collections, as well as historic pieces. And then we're fortunate to have some contemporary items that Austin and Chris brought with them. So it might make sense if I've talked enough already. So I'll move out of frame and turn it over to you guys. No, do you want to introduce yourself and say a little bit about your background?
Christopher Lewis, hello, my name is Christopher Lewis. I'm a member of the Basketry clan, child to the Fun clan, and I live in the front. My experience with basketry comes from a lifelong commitment on learning different techniques and stuff, because we basically almost lost our basketry making skills in learning. And it's been a 16-year commitment to revive the basketry technology and taboos, customs, and cultural knowledge behind it. So I'm a native scholar on the senior baseball team up to Laurie Webster, where we go to different museums and look at perishable Cedar Mesa in Utah. So I get to look at a lot of prehistoric baskets, sandals, the coil work, plated basketry, and other things. It's a very unique opportunity for me to study a lot of those things, the way they were made and assembled, and to try and replicate.
Great. Thank you. Austin.
Lolma, the Austin Coochyamptewa, yan Matsua. The Tawi, Williams, Tawi sa yan Paho, yan Hopi Matsua. Hello, my name is Austin. My Hopi name is Williams Tawisa. I am still fairly new to a lot of the artwork and basketry, and I have been traveling along with Chris, and by going with him to museums and looking in the collections that they have, I've begun to have an interest on learning more about prehistoric baskets all the way to the now modern baskets, and seeing how they've changed from way back then to now, what has stayed the same and what has changed throughout the years. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you guys for being here. So I think it makes the most sense. Maybe we begin and talk a little bit about the archaeological materials, and then we can sort of move forward in time and tease out some of those connections. And if questions arise, I think it might be easiest for all of us if you were to enter those questions in the chat. And then as time permits and we're able to, what we'll do is we'll respond in time to those questions. So some of the items that you see on display here, and we'll pick up and bring a little bit closer to the screen in a moment, are objects that reflect from a technological perspective, but also from sort of the long perspective of deep time in archaeology in the Americas, are some basic core technologies that provide a firm foundation for a lot of traditional weaving industries. So baskets, textiles, these are terms that we typically oftentimes use interchangeably, in large part because many of the techniques of fabrication, the weaving techniques and methods, the ways in which the fibers and the elements, the yarns that they interact with one another are fundamentally the same. And the difference really is often only coming down to the rigidity of the materials, the type of the materials. And so in many ways, whether it's a basket or a mat, which we tend to think of as more rigid and three-dimensional, they are in many senses fundamentally textile technologies. And what you see here are a selection of objects that represent sort of, in many ways, sort of the two primary weaving techniques, plating, or otherwise known as interlacing. It's that weave structure in which the elements simply pass over and under one another. And that's what you see represented here in a variant that we think of as twill, where we get sort of a staggered interval. Okay, and these appear to be bulrush stems, the genus Shonoplectus, and they interlace with one another, pass over and under each other in a 2-2 interval, and so it creates that staggered herringbone type of visual appearance. And again, this is in many ways a very simple technology, but one which is extremely versatile in terms of the types and forms of vessels and things that you can make. To the extent that we see objects that vary from pot rests to baskets, containers, to much larger forms. Here we have an example of the second sort of major weaving technology, coil basketry. Technically, it's a fabric type where the stitches are sewn, so it's not weaving in a narrow sense, but technically sewing. We have a rigid element called the foundation, which is then bound together, secured to a flexible element called a stitch. And this technology, like the other mats and baskets you see before you, represent, in this case, more recent examples of technologies that go back at least 12,000 years in the Americas and are undoubtedly much, much older than that. Coiling, however, is a little bit younger. It goes back perhaps nearly 9,000 to 10,000 years ago. The examples that you see here were items that we selected from sites that by and large come from northeastern Arizona, sort of from the Four Corners area, all the way down into sort of the Fort Apache region, and as far west as Navajo National Monument. Would you like to start with one object in particular?
Well, the first one I would like to start off with is one that I saw in the collections that I was very interested in. And that was the okay. Don't want to bring it.
I got it.
Okay. Okay. Is the Wicker plaque. And on Hopi, we do have what we call a yayapa. And by looking at this, what was the year on this?
This is from Canyon Creek Ruin, and this dates to, based on ceramics that are associated probably the late 1300s AD.
Yeah.
Thereabouts.
So seeing how long that this basket was made, it was very interesting to see that by looking at the newer ones out on Hopi, there isn't really a whole lot of change from the prehistoric baskets to now. By looking at this, we see that they're still that they use the doom broom as well as the rabbit brush. And even on baskets today, all the materials are the same, and how it's woven is not really different from back then to now. I couldn't tell on the ring because it's not there, but that was just something that really interested me to know that this sort of way technique on making baskets still is surviving and living well all the way into today's today. And so I wanted to go ahead and bring more of a newer type of Yungyaplo to show you on how it hasn't really much changed. So as you can see, it's still the same way woven, except this one is a little bit more, a lot more intricate, and the newer ones have a lot more color to them. But yet, by also looking at it, looking at more of the prehistoric baskets, I see that they have this mound in the middle, and with the, I guess, more historic baskets, they also retain that same mound. But as time went by, it seems like the mound had begun to become more flat into the basket that I had just shown you earlier. So, but I said this was one of the ones that I really wanted to bring out and show that there's not a whole lot of change between the baskets made prehistorically to baskets that you would find today in the villages that the ladies are still making for household use and ceremonies. Oh, as well as for the rings, on this one, for historical baskets, they used the willow, no. Oh, it's the same thing for the doom broom, but this one is more in a twist. Whereas now, you don't really see this too much anymore. As far as I have seen back in the villages, now you get more of a, more of the edging is now done with the yucca that is bounded and wrapped around the edges to create this solid black edging on there. So those are just some of the minor differences that I see in some of them, but other than that, a lot of them are still constructed as they were a long time ago to now.
I think one of the interesting things too that we talked about is how much this is a particular style of weaving, and wickerware is not a term that a lot of us who sort of basketry nerds who specialize in this have a great fondness for, because it doesn't tell us much about structure very accurately. It simply describes that texture and appearance that we tend to associate with everything from baskets like this to some people's porch furniture. And while it captures a specific texture, it's not telling us anything about the nature of interaction between the elements and the fabric structure. These are a variant of plating or interlacing, the technique that's fundamentally represented by the matting that I showed you initially, but which produces this distinctive texture by virtue of the use of the rabbit brush and the dune broom, and the way the elements are packed down, and the spacing between the vertical and horizontal elements. And this is something that I think speaks to not only some of the versatility of this a structure for creating fabrics, but it's also something that I think is really distinctive of Hopi and Zuni basketry in particular. That as a technique from an archaeological perspective, it shows up. And in fact, the Canyon Creek specimen that we're looking at right here is actually probably one of the earliest dated examples that we have of this technology in the American Southwest. And it's going back to the 14th century. Where it comes from and how much earlier than that, we don't have a good sense. But these are traditions and technologies that persist at communities, public communities today, pretty much uninterrupted, and they're distinctive in that regard. You can tell a Wicker, Hopi, and Zuni basket apart from a Wicker basket produced in Indonesia easily, for example.
Can you talk about the use and the meaning of the pattern and the design?
You can hold if you want to point the top.
As far as, well, I'm from Second Mesa, from the Sunday Village. And so these baskets right here all come from Third Mesa ladies that would make them over there. Ours is more in the coil basket that would be made. But from what I can see on this one would have a butterfly design that is placed into the basket. And this one, if I'm correct, they call it the whirling winds design that is put on that one.
I'll jump over to that side.
Okay.
That was on Hopi wicker work. On this one, switch over to Zuni wicker work. A lot of the wicker work done in Zuni was utilitarian, so it was more cooking, cooking baskets or winnowing, drying. Also, some of them were carrying items, objects. This one here is made from willow. It's a nice shape wicker basket, a bowl shape. So they went for kind of similar start to the Hopi way, but they with the bundle, they foil them, and then spread out from there. Stated earlier to Austin, you start weaving with family, your work, your web will go around, and when basically get too much, and you need to add tailors. Then you start inviting friends to the party and you add friends into your family. Weaving, pretty soon you have to invite a lot more friends, and the next thing you know, you're having a block party. So that's the way I was explaining it to him, how you keep adding in more and more and more, how you, and then after it gets to 4, you split it, and we keep adding the one another 4, you split every 4 you split 2, then you add 1 more, and you go add another 1, 4. So by the time you're done, your friends on the outside could easily be almost 200 friends in the party. Then like the Hopi ones, we do the. Then like the Hopi ones, we do pre-contact, as I call it, style of finish on the basket. It's done with the yucca, but Zunis add this little extra to anchor the ring to the secure to the basket. So if you pick it up, it won't pull out or separate. So Zunis add, this one has 1, but sometimes they'll go down like an inch, 3/4 inch, 1/2 inch, 1/4. So they'll do these little thread steps on the edge of the basket when they bind off the rim. So this is a good example of a Zuni utilitarian basket for winnowing, for washing, like using it as a strainer, a drying rack, and they can put breads, things in it, and carry it to relatives' house, wherever they're going. Now, this one here is another good example of a wicker basket that is pueblo style. They were also made in a lot of the small Spanish towns in New Mexico. This is post-contact. This style of finishing off baskets were introduced by the Europeans. Holdovers in the back weaving. This one has also braid underneath. Braid to finish it off. The different ways of weaving that you can do with these, weaving on fire and putting the all over, compacting them tight, so it's all more solid form to finish it off a basket. And this is all done in willow, red willow. These are historic pieces, and then on the outside or contemporary pieces that I did. So if you see this one, this is more shallow because it was specifically made to order. My wife wanted a shallow basket to fit on the sink, so when she washes her corn or drains her tamales, it all goes straight into the sink. Right now, if you look at it, and I just now realized it before we started, the whole basket has salt on it. It was used to cook parched corn and salt the corn up when it was hot. But it's not moldy, it's just covered in salt. But it's done the same way. You have the three bundles, the start, two of them overlapping, then it builds up from there, and it's done. When I was taught this one, I was taught by a Hopi lady from Third Mesa, and she had me finish it off in the Hopi style, which was completely bound, straight rim, no ink points on it. So that's what this one, how this one was done. And then this one here, this started the same way as the large basket, but not quite as many willow in the upper part. This is the red willow with purple willow. So it's got a darker band around the edge. Also, with the false bottom. False bottoms allow fruits and stuff to breathe on the table, so the heat doesn't build up and make your fruits, vegetables go funky or anything. So both of these two have false bottom on them.
Now, of course, this one is entirely the red willow.
Yes, all red willow, but one is the darker reds, burgundies, purples. That means that was a really cold winter, so the color is really deep and intensifies.
I have to say too, it's something that is missing or being lost by the fact that this is virtual, but there's a really great odor to the fresh willow that I just really appreciate. It adds to the experience of having a basket around and using a basket is how good they smell when they're fresh.
We had a question about willow harvesting. Could you talk about that process?
Harvesting willow, I tend to do from the first snowfall to the first thunder in winter time. Once the willow starts losing its leaves, all of the sap is going into the trunk and makes it really pliable, bendable. You have less breakage when you're weaving a basket. So a lot of times I'll get dropped off about 12 miles from the village, and then I hike into a specific canyon, about a mile and a half hike. It's one of the few east-west canyons that will have no sunlight in it up until about mid-April. So that's the last place willow will not get its buds or leaves. So I can work with it later, harvest later. Not much prep other than cutting them and sorting sizes, things like that. I'll cut winter willow near the end of the season, put it in, roll it in a contractor bag, and throw it in the deep freezer if I'm going to do any willow basket demonstrating in the summertime. That way I have a supply of winter willow on hand. That's the only difference now.
That might be a good point of departure to talk a little bit about the coiling, because I think we probably, I think our best educated guess would be that archaeological basket is not willow, but more than likely sumac. And we spent time talking about not just the collection and processing of raw materials used for basketry, but also some of the challenges posed by more recent changes to landscapes, as well as changes that were brought about by impositions by the Spanish and colonizers, and the impact that had on the accessibility and availability of particular basketry plants. And so one of the things that you remarked is that there today at least aren't really any good spots where you can find sumac.
We're still looking, hunting around for wild stands of sumac in Zuni, around Zuni. Don't know where they used to collect. The traditional harvesting areas, I think once that access, we were restricted from travel more than a mile from the village at one time, and that would have greatly impacted collecting, harvesting sumac, yucca, for a lot of things, which in turn would have led to the decline in basketry, that technology. So right now, we know there is sumac around Zuni, but we just haven't found good places where they're growing in large quantities, because it would have to be, once we find it, we would have to cut back and nurture it, and that could take several years of care and maintenance to get a good growth, straight growth to split and make your stitching material for coil basketry.
That basket thing. So what Chris is pointing out really well is the amount of time and labor and effort that goes into not just the collection and harvesting of this, but you have to know where to go to get it, what time to collect it, the proper ways to harvest and collect the materials that allow for it to be sustainable. And it's certainly one of those things that if you think about the Spanish placing such severe constraints on a whole village, that's going to vastly alter one's ability as an individual and certainly in a community to acquire the necessary plants. Nonetheless, make sufficient trips out to tend and look after the plants. And so when I see some of these archaeological baskets or all of these, I'm not just thinking about the time and labor and effort, but the long-term commitment that the Weaver and their family made to looking after the sumac and the willow and the bulrush and the other plants, and making sure that they were being taken care of so that they could take care of people. And really, this is just sort of an exceptionally fine basket. This is unfortunately a site from the best that we know about is it's from Apache County, Arizona. So it's largely unprovenance. But the technology really fits well within what we see in the sort of the Four Corners region and the Colorado Plateau. And it's not common for the starts of the center to be damaged through use wear or get knocked loose. In this case, it looks like this was heavily worn and used for a variety of tasks. It's got a really very simple but effective design on the exterior. And then Chris, you selected this. I don't know if you want to, while we're in that same sort of line of thinking, talk about this one.
Okay. Reason why I pulled this one, it's a nice small basket, clearly shows the base, everything. The reason why I chose it was because it's a good example of a question I had in Zuni. We call a basket Hopi. We call a human being Hopi. They share the same beginning. And when I asked elders, a lot of them said, yeah, they share the same, but we don't know why. I finally got my answer a couple of years ago because a basket represents a human life. When you look at the center of the basket and a human being, we all have a belly button where our umbilical cord comes from. So in a basket, that's the beginning. And from that umbilical cord, we start our journey in life, which spirals out all the way until we come to the end of the basket, like in human life, we come to the end of our road. So the coils on the basket represents the road of human's life. So I always wondered, about that, why was it called Hopi? And how much importance was placed on a coiled basket. And a lot of the stuff we did, the cultural ties, religious ties, all of that to a coiled basketry. Like if you say the wicker work, or a Hopi, the ring baskets. And why a lot of stuff has to be put in a coiled basket and not any of the other ones, because a coiled basket has solid wall and will hold everything as our life road holds all of our being, our breath, our thoughts, our memories. Whereas a whole tablet has holes in it, which will leak out and you lose everything. That's why that's the way it was explained to me. So I said, I can understand that and why the importance and significance of coiled basket, how highly valued they are, and they hold dominant position in anything we do. Because even like at death, when someone reaches the end of their life, a basket is put there, and everything they wear is put in the basket. How that time is when they take it back out and dress the person. That's how important these baskets are. I picked this one because I like the design. It's unique, nice, but it's the same. It's it looks like it's a one rod and bundle foundation. And then the other unique thing about this one is the rim finish is not around a rod. It's done flat. Got a unique little shape and form to it. Different. The sumac that I get, we go to Bluff, Utah in the fall, and I'll cut sumac. If we're staying there a couple days, I'll cut sumac and I'll spend the evening peeling it, splitting it, thinning it out, and then as Austin can tell you, we smell sumac in the car all the way. And then when he drops me off and I take the sumac with me, that odor lingers in his car for at least 2 weeks. And besides using the sumac for making stitch material, you also can make the whole thing into rings for ring baskets. And like right now, a lot of people are picking the berries, because the berries are edible and they eating all of the sumac berries right now.
Can you give the ages of some of these?
Yeah, so just for point of comparison, we already mentioned that a lot of the archaeological material here largely dates to the last 1,000, 1,300 years, give or take for those objects. In this particular case, we're dealing with, in some circumstances, baskets which were manufactured the turn of the 20th century. If I recall correctly, this pot rest is early 1900s. Some of the wicker plaques would date to the 30s, 40s. And then certainly these other baskets, I think some of these have dates that indicate they were being produced up until the 50s or 60s. And that would be sort of the extent of it for what you see here. We have some older, obviously, and some younger objects in the collection, but that's sort of the age range you see represented here on the table before you.
Please discuss the bulrush mats. For example, where are they from and the age?
Well, it's one of those things that we talk about now. It's a great deal of evidence for continuity in particular techniques and traditions and technologies. And I think, Chris's example and illustration of not only, when languages are lost and no longer being spoken with great frequency among their communities or within their communities, we're not only losing insights into ways of thinking about and viewing the world, but we're also losing these connections to technologies and plants and landscapes. And that, thinking about the way in which the baskets might be understood as symbolic or related and signifying humans and their growth and development is something that is intimately connected to not just the growth of the plants and the landscapes, but that transmission of knowledge across generations. And as much as we see great continuity, we see evidence for invention, technological change, the incorporation of new ideas from neighboring communities and peoples. We have instances where some technologies are dramatically altered, or in some cases even appear to drop out of the archaeological record. One of the examples that we often talk about is some of the changes in footwear. Sandals more or less disappeared from the archaeological record by about AD 1300. There also appears to be a increase in hide trade and exchange. And so we also have to think about it not just in terms of landscapes, but how people are using different resources on the landscape. So bulrush matting is one of these things that appears to show up. Some of the earliest examples appear to date to maybe the AD 800s or thereabouts in the Four Corners region of the Southwest. And then by the AD 1000s, 1100s is ubiquitous. It's one of the most common organic artifacts that you might encounter at a lot of sites in the Four Corners region. And many times they occur with these rather intricate borders, which represent a series of sort of complex folds and interlacements before the elements are clipped off and the mat is finished. We don't have a really good analog or point of comparison in more recent material because some of the latest collected mats, I think that we were talking about, probably are from the early 1900s at Zuni. And even then, it doesn't appear that there was a lot of matting being made.
Yeah.
So while matting is something that's ubiquitous cross-culturally and certainly in the indigenous Americas, there was sort of a dramatic decrease in production, at least from the archaeological record by the 1300s, and it's sort of has been lost from the historical record in the Southwest in more recent times. But it's one of these things that, you know, hundreds of years ago would have been, again, ubiquitous. People were sleeping on mats. People were buried in mats. People, you know, were carrying and transporting things in mats. People were made on mats. Everything happened within the frame of a mat. And so I think it's a nice illustration of how, you know, we get these glimpses into what people were doing when we get such exceptional preservation. And in this case, it's a glimpse of some of the bits and pieces and clues that we're missing.
And the reason why I pulled this one out was because, for one thing, after reading the card on there and finding out that it's actually from my village of the Zuni, and more so, the name on this basket was from Lily Mae Tawahumba. And so, you know, I have a friend that has a Tawahumba last name too, so I contacted him and asked him if he knew the person. He said, yeah, that's my grandma. So, you know, I told him that, you know, we found a basket here, and he was really happy to hear that it's here, and, you know, thanked me for letting him know. But, you know, I'm looking at some of these baskets and, you know, going into different collections, you know, it's really opening my mind to see that it wasn't just one style like I'm so accustomed to seeing back home, which is this style right here, which you would normally always see back home, but also normally see this one. So this is what I was always accustomed to seeing. But after looking at many variety of baskets that were collected all over the Southwest, I'm seeing that there is a whole lot of similarities that are close to what Hopi makes, to what Zuni and all the other pueblos are still doing today. And that was also by looking at the very beginning, as far back as where I can see this basket right here.
Okay. Let's see. I think this one is from, I believe this is from National Monument area, Safety Canyon.
Or at least like the year, or not year, but at least the time frame about
1200s, 1300s.
around 1300s, and just, you know, analyzing and looking at how it's constructed, the materials that were used in there, and still seeing the same thing like I did with the Wicker pipes, and that a lot of it is still done the same way that we are doing it today. You know, there's little minor changes in binding, in designs and how it's put together, but a lot of it I found really interesting to see that it's still been surviving all those years, all the way until now, and still hoping that it's still going to survive longer than any of us that are still here. But I've been seeing that these baskets here are all with the natural, using just the natural references that have the designs on them. But nowadays you're getting from this being the natural apparatus, the whole basket, to now you have color in them. And some of the ones that I've been talking to that possibly color really didn't start coming into our color diamond, but it didn't really start taking off until maybe around 1850, 1860s, when you start seeing a majority of colored baskets really booming out there. And that was due to the railroad being established near Winslow. And a lot of tourists that were and people coming out to the reservation, and so they wanted to see more intricate designs. What can the people do that can make it more elaborate? That's when we started really seeing also within, as an example, was the tunnels. From a simple carving to now, traders wanted something that was more elaborate. So now you have a lot of these very intricate full figure dolls, and that's where a lot of that began, was the railroad. So, but these were what I really wanted to pull out and show a little bit of how little things have changed from prehistoric baskets here all the way to baskets that are still produced today. Yeah.
What,
To add to what Austin just said, prehistoric baskets were woven with a whole leaf. The only difference was they did not split their leaves like the way they do nowadays, where it's a wider cut for it to take the coloring. So if you look at how it's split, you get a wide area, and that wide area is what takes the color. Okay, now if we switch over to this basket, a good example of what they're doing, and you look at it, is they were taking small amounts off of the back of the yucca, very thin strips, and weaving them. In a lot of the baskets that I look at, the design is in the weave, the way they wove the patterns, the way they basically do building off of a diamond, but they would do diamonds with rows of diamonds, borders, checkerboard patterns with diamonds, half diamonds. Some of these patterns they had in their weaving. Now, mind you, all of this is woven in green, and you're having to pick and see the whole design on a green background. No color or anything to help you differentiate the pattern you're doing. It's all done on a green. Mr. Jolie, I mean that little one. Now this basket is one that Austin wove during the demonstration the other day. We kind of collaborated on this basket. He was weaving this, and I looked at him. I said, "Hey, when you weave this, can you leave the ends, and I'll add a false braid to that. I'll do it. We'll finish it off as a Mesa Verde style." Now, Mesa Verde plated ring baskets with a false braid rim were made 850, 900 years ago, and it kind of disappeared. It was a very small group of people that were making this style of a basket, and then it kind of tapered off. There's another one that we found that's from Cedar Mesa. I studied that basket, and the way it was done at Edge of the Cedars Museum in Blanding, Utah. But this basket he wove, he put it on the rim, or the ring, which is a thick willow ring, and then I came back and I did the false braid, which covers that fringe on the way when you weave a basket, you have all this where you cut the edges of the yucca are exposed. So this false braid covers that whole edge of fringe. But this is was typical of a certain style of basket that was made at Mesa Verde. So we did work on this one together, just for fun since we were down here. So this collaboration from the two of us. He did the inside, all natural yucca, no colors, and then I came back and did the false braid on the edge of it.
Now, one thing that I did want to make sure that we came back to was your observation about color and sort of late introduction of color, but then also some of the types of things that we learned by working with materials or hanging out with people like Chris and Austin, who know the materials so well, is examples of some of these technologies that are really more common in the Pueblo and Southwest and beyond, but which you don't think about sometimes the sort of the performance characteristics of the plants in terms of being receptive to dyes, as it were. And so this basket is one that was collected about 50, 60 years ago at Jemez Pueblo in New Mexico, and employs bear grass is the common name, but there are a lot of plants with that common name, and it's of the genus Nolina. It tends to grow in rocky settings of higher elevations. We do see some varieties down here in southern Arizona that are used for ornamentals, but they produce these really long leaves. And Chris has already mentioned how the length of leaves can be a limiting factor in terms of the size of the basket that you might be able to produce without having to add in new leaves. The advantage with some of the Nolan or beargrass leaves is that they get really, really long. They almost sort of look like similar to the Dasylirion or the Sotol that you might see in landscaping. They kind of look like Medusa's head with leaves going every which way, but they get really long. But why is it challenging to introduce color on a basket made out of beargrass?
The epidermis won't take color.
Yeah, and so I hadn't given it any thought, but Chris was really quick to point out that you're not going to find any with any color because they don't take a dye. The outer epidermis is really impermeable in that sense, and so it's a really sort of interesting observation, something to keep in mind that we don't often think about when we think about color. It's just these are dyed. This is dyed. Yeah.
No, not that. That's
No,
natural.
that's all natural. This one, and this is natural as well. So these are yucca leaves collected at Carson different times, and this was the functional processing.
Yeah, so with it being split, when you split the yucca, it leaves that really nice light color green on the inside. But when you use the back sides, it has the darker. So that's what's able to make the design inside of the basket. Whereas this one right here, you can use plant dyes, but this one right here was I used a commercial on this one. But you can use a lot of plant dyes. It's just kind of a lot of tedious work to go and collect them and wait sometimes different time of the year to be able to get those materials. You can use the dyes on these ones as well.
And as Austin said, this is a commercial dye. This is all split yucca. Split, dried, and then dyed. Dried yucca will absorb more of the dye color, make it darker. If you split yucca fresh, you tend to end up with more pastel colors because it's already wet and it can't absorb any more liquid. What I wanted to point out is how dark it is here, but when you turn it over, as you can see, the epidermis doesn't dye as well as a split surface. So this shows a good example of the epidermis itself not taking the dye color. What you're seeing is the inner part that absorbed the dye, and it's showing up darker, but the epidermis is still green. It's just a slight color difference. Dye material, it depends on what you're trying to accomplish, what your goal is. You get a lot of, most of the time, bright colors are made with commercial dyes, the RIT dyes, things like that, that you can buy like in Walmart, Hobby Lobby, wherever. And you get the bright, vibrant colors. When I'm doing a organic dye, I'll be calling Austin, I'll be sending him pictures. The last one I did, January 1st, I boiled 2.5 gallon bags of brown lichen to get a nice goldish orange color. So it took 2.5 gallon bags to boil one bundle of yucca. And that was boiling it for about 3 hours, adding in salt and nowadays I don't use the red clay. Traditionally, red clay was used because it has a high iron content. It's so much easier just to go out and pick up the rusty nails out around the house, around the garden area, throw them in a coffee can and fill it with water and let it sit as it evaporates all that rust. Throw a lid on it and shake it and empty the dust powder into a jar and add more water and just keep the process going. So build up all that rust powder and add 2-3 spoonfuls of that into your dye bath, and there's your mordant. So that affects the color to the material you're using. But natural dyes take a lot of organic material to dye a small amount.
So there's a question about designs. Are designs family based?
Not by one particular family. A lot of designs, I guess, I don't know, maybe would be a little more unique to each village, but as for the sifter baskets, it's not really fully standard, one type of design. They'll change, I guess, depending on the weaver. What they're thinking as they're weaving it, how they're feeling. That's what will determine what kind of design will come into the basket. Like I say, anything that you make, the basket will pretty much tell you how it wants to come out. You try to force it to put what you want in there, then it's not going to work. It will either the leaves will either keep cracking, snapping. Something won't go right. So it's what the basket wants you to put in it. But for this one in particular, the design in the middle was, someone referred to it as the whirling logs. But from what I've been told, how I understood was that this was a migration symbol with rain droplets around it. You have water waves on there, and the symbols on the sides, which are represent protection symbols. So there's a whole lot of different it's very symbolic. It could have a story to it, but it's just depending on the weaver and what he or she is wanting to put into that basket.
Okay, when you look at the pot rest here, I'm not sure where this one came from, but this is a prehistoric example of a plated pot rest. The earliest one that I have seen was almost 2,000 years old. It was made very similar to the way
they were done.
I think that's one of the prayer registry sites in northeastern Arizona, not far from the Coochyamptewa Mountains. And that's where I'm recalling it's from, and it may well date to the somewhere between the AD 800s and the 1100s.
Yeah, the oldest one I saw was from Grand Gulch, and it had died yucca woven into it in a pattern. This one is 2 over 2 under pattern. And as old as they are, you do find them in the historic time. This is a good example of one, Zuni made one, the same 2 over 2 under 2. And these were made hundreds of years ago, continuing all to present day. Currently, right now, there's only about 5 people that make them, and they're all pretty much building. You see these ones. This was made 2 weeks ago. See? Yeah, these were made 2 weeks ago, and they're the over 2 under 2 pattern. This was made a couple of days ago here at the museum at the street. If you look at them, they're made exactly the same way that historic one and the prehistoric one were made. They're all the same pattern.
It's pretty striking. And this was the sort of a happy accident to come across this one, because this one had actually been in the collections labeled as, I think, probably Hopi. Yeah, Chris looked at it and he said, no, that's definitely Zuni.
So this was another revival on the progress. I studied a damaged one, sat with it, studied it for 3 hours, pulled out some yucca, and took another 2 hours to read the first one, and that was 12 years ago. And I talked to 2 other Zunis who picked it up and went from there, where we're at now, the progress. But the heyday of progress was when they were made by the hundreds was at Mesa Verde in that time. You see a lot of progress from there, different shapes and forms of it. Not very important. But this is another plated technique. And it's a continuous weave all the way around.
Yeah, for folks who were fortunate to join us on Monday, we had an opportunity to see Chris produce one of these. And I remember the first time I saw him make one of these, it was one of those aha moments of, that's how they did that. And it looks kind of innocuous, but also surprising, because in essence, it starts as sort of it's a large flat braid, if you want to think about it that way, that you then sort of curl around to make almost like a tire form, and manipulate the elements from there. It's something that's hard to wrap your head around. Do you think it would have been possible to sort of work it out had you not seen the damaged one, or would just have taken longer?
We have them at home, and I looked at them and looked at them and looked at them and couldn't figure it out. We took the damaged one to see the internal structure to figure out how it was constructed. Just looking at a complete one like this, I was like, how did they do this? But I needed to actually see the internal structure to figure out what they were doing with the other elements. Once I figured out
the internal structure of these pot rests, then everything in my mind fell into place. And from there, I completed one, and right off started the second one and the third one. And like right now, it takes what took me 2 hours to make. I currently 40 minutes. It still takes me hours, but that's just the cleaning and prep, but the actual weaving from start to finish about 40 minutes to finish one ring.
That's probably gonna be my next question is, having seen you work in the processing of materials, I might even venture to say that the processing and collection, that takes longer than it does for you to actually weave the progress. I think you produced one of those in about 45 minutes on Monday,
Yeah.
maybe even less.
Yeah, and it took me, on average, it would take me 3 to 8 hours of looking for the right kind of yucca. Just the gathering, go home and spend a good hour and a half cleaning the yucca, prepping. And all of these are whole leaves, and they're just the whole leaf. Hot rest in Zuni about 100, a little over 100 years ago, all have a thin strip of yucca taken off. So they're green, but they have these thin white lines in the whole weave, because they would take that small amount off.
What other types of natural dyes might be used for basketry?
I only know of like the ground lichen makes it really nice, bright orange, goldish orange color, depending on how much you're adding. Reddish browns, you get mountain mahogany root, avoiding that. When I collect and process sumac, I'll save the leaves and the bark from that, and you boil that. Add a lot of rust to it, or rusty metal, you get a nice black. That's basically what I've experimented with, trying to get colors from plants around, or plants that I harvest for my basket materials and stuff, or for dye materials, around like things like that. The other one is imported stuff. That's the avocado skins. We eat a lot of avocados, so I'll wash them, dry them, crush them, and bag them. I did 3 pounds of avocado skins, or 3 gallon bags of avocado skins. We got a really nice pink on my yucca. That's pretty much what I've tried so far. Just the ground lichen, the mountain mahogany, and sumac from the wild, and then it's the thornbark, it's just the avocado skins.
So we have a question here. I noticed that Austin used the term prehistoric in contact when referring to the archaeological past. Would you be willing to comment on those respective terms?
Okay, the reason why I use, and it's only with the Wicker work that I use pre-contact, post-contact, is because of the 2 distinct ways of finishing off the Wicker work. When I'm talking about it, I'll say this is a pre-contact way of finishing off the rib. I don't know why I never really kind of thought of it as prehistoric, but it's just because Wicker work came at the very later part of into the Pueblo world, just before European contact. So it was being made up until then. So it's the pre-contact way of finishing off Wicker work, I say. And then this is the post-contact after the Spanish came in, the priests taught this style of the European style of finishing off the wicker work. So that's what I come in using on the wicker work. I come in using the pre-contact, post-contact, because it's still the wicker work, but just the styles of the way they're woven, the way they're finished shows the distinct influences of the European people that came in and taught their technology, their style of weaving to the native community.
I think that there's also a generational component in terms of some of the terms that are preferred to be used, in as much as prehistoric is not a term that I think we have been necessarily as comfortable with as some people are today. Certainly, terms or labels like Indian is something that for some younger people, it seems another generational choice or decision where it seems much more offensive, whereas certainly people of my young age don't find it as offensive. It's what we grew up with. There's still a lot of friends that use the term Indian. And people prefer terms like Native American or Native or even Indigenous. And I like to remind them that, as problematic as terms like Indian might be, Native and Indigenous are not unproblematic terms in themselves. If we really want to think critically about the terms and labels that we use, then we kind of have to be consistent in how we engage with those terms. And so I think it's good to have an understanding, appreciation for the different types of terms that people use and why they use them. I do really try to remind people and caution people to be careful about jumping to conclusions based on the terms that someone uses, unless there's something like they're blatantly offensive. We're not fans of that. But terms like prehistoric have largely fallen out of favor. But it also speaks to some of the ways in which we think about the past and the ways in which our thinking about the past has changed. And so there's a lesson in that, I think, as well. Well, it looks like we're very close to running out of time. Those I do want to express my sincere gratitude and thanks to Chris and Austin. I've had a blast. I hope you all have too. I also want to make sure I thank the Arizona State Museum membership and the Friends of the Collection for all their support, which has really made this and Monday's program entirely possible. We're grateful for your attention and time.